One subject I believe major Canadian media outlets are not portraying well is the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities. While Canadian media outlets often cover Indigenous issues, there's a significant gap in their coverage of the complex relationship between Indigenous land rights and the energy sector. This is particularly evident when comparing the coverage of major Canadian outlets like CBC and CTV with independent Indigenous media and international news sources. Firstly, the lack of context and historical perspective. Firstly, CBC and CTV often focus on immediate conflicts like protests against the pipelines without adequacy explaining the historical context of Indigenous land right and treaty obligations. Also, independent Indigenous media provide deeper historical context, highlighting the ongoing struggle for self-determination and the impact of resource extraction on Indigenous communities. For example, CBC's coverage of the Coastal GasLink pipeline often focuses on the protests and legal battles, while Indigenous media like APTN and CBC's own Indigenous language program offer a more nuanced perspective on the historical land claims and the impact on Indigenous communities. CBC and CTV often frame Indigenous resistance as anti-development, focusing on the economic beliefs of resource extraction without acknowledging the potential environment and social impact on Indigenous communities. The independent Indigenous media frame Indigenous resistance as a fight for self-determination, environmental protection, and the preservation of cultural traditions. Here am I going to show you a video about an example of CTV's coverage of the Wet'suwet'en protests.
Indigenous leaders and their supporters briefly shut down one side of the Cambie Street Bridge today. As CTV's Ben Milger reports, they hope to draw attention to unceded Wet'suwet'en territory where a conflict over the Coastal GasLink pipeline remains unresolved.
Drumming and singing followed speeches at Vancouver City Hall, and then several dozen people took to the streets, blocking traffic in a bid to draw more attention to the plight of the planet and Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs' efforts to stop a natural gas pipeline.
Tests often portrays the hereditary chiefs as blocking the pipeline, while Indigenous media highlights their role as the protectors of the traditional territory and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. The lack of Indigenous voices. CBC and CTV often rely on the government officials and industry representatives for their perspectives, neglecting to include Indigenous voices and perspectives on the issue. The independent Indigenous media provide a platform for Indigenous voices, allowing them to share their experiences, concerns, and aspirations. For example, CBC's coverage of the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric project often quotes government officials and industry representatives, while Indigenous media like Nunantiak News and CBC's own Indigenous language program features the voice of Inuit communities directly impacted by the project. The international news sources often provides a more critical perspective on Canada's energy sector and its impact on Indigenous communities, highlights the global implications of the resource extractions and the needs for Indigenous rights to be respected. For example, The Guardian's coverage of the Trans Mountain Pipeline's expansion project highlights the environmental concerns and the potential for Indigenous communities to be disproportionately affected. In conclusion, the lack of comprehensive and nuanced coverage of Indigenous land right and the energy sector in Canada by major media outlets perpetuate a harmful narrative that ignores the historical context, the voices of Indigenous communities, and the potential for sustainable development that respect Indigenous rights. By amplifying Indigenous voices, providing historical context, and challenging the dominant narrative, Canadian media can contribute to more than just equitable future for Indigenous communities and the environment.